All right, let's just get right into it. We are talking about Ezekiel chapter 16 today, which is, and I'm not exaggerating, probably the most sexually explicit and frankly shocking chapter in the entire Bible. It's so graphic that some have actually called it pornographic. And believe it or not, that was the whole point.
And look, you gotta understand, this isn't just shock for shock's sake. As the biblical scholar Dan Block puts it, this whole semi-pornographic style is a very deliberate rhetorical device. It's a tool, and it was specifically crafted to provoke a really strong gut-level emotional reaction from the person reading it. So that begs the question, right? Why on earth would the Bible use a style that feels like pornography? Well, the answer is that the entire chapter is one giant, deeply uncomfortable metaphor. And to really get what it's saying, we have to unpack the story it tells, from the very beginning to the very end. So the story kicks off by giving us a main character, but it's not a person. It's the city of Jerusalem. And this isn't the glorious golden city you might be picturing. Nope. The prophet Ezekiel paints a very, very different picture of where she came from. The chapter tells us that Jerusalem's father was an Amorite and her mother a Hittite, which is basically saying she came from pagan stock. She's described as a newborn baby who's been abandoned, tossed out into a field to die. Her umbilical cord wasn't even cut. She's unwashed, uncared for, completely abhorred by her own parents. Nobody wanted her. And this is where the story completely flips. God is passing by, and he sees this discarded infant just lying there in her own blood, and he says to her, "Live." He rescues her, he raises her, and when she's grown up, he enters into a covenant with her, basically a marriage vow. He cleans her up, clothes her in the most beautiful silks and jewels, and transforms her into this stunning, famous queen. It is the ultimate rags to royalty story.
But then, verse 15 hits, and the whole thing just takes a nosedive. The text says, "But you trusted in your beauty and played the whore." This rescued queen, this beautiful bride, begins this absolutely horrifying descent into total depravity. Now, the language here is so important. The prophet could have used the Hebrew word na'ap, which just means adultery, a one-time infidelity, but he doesn't. Instead, he uses the word zina, and he uses it 21 times. This word means a professional whore, someone whose business is habitual, who has tons of partners. It's a much more powerful way to show the sheer scale of the betrayal. And her depravity just keeps escalating, step by horrifying step. First, she takes the beautiful clothes God gave her and uses them to decorate these pagan shrines, these so-called beds of love. Then, she melts down the gold jewelry from her husband to make male idols, likely phallic ones, to pleasure herself with. And then it gets even worse. She takes her own children, who the text says were born to God, and sacrifices them in fire to these idols. Finally, she just becomes a public spectacle, building a stage on every street corner, where she, as the Hebrew puts it, spreads her legs for any man walking by. But there's another layer to this metaphor. The sexual stuff wasn't just about spiritual betrayal, it was a direct symbol for political betrayal. See, instead of trusting God for protection, Jerusalem was running around making shady alliances with all the big world powers, Egypt, Assyria, and the Chaldeans, who you might know as Babylon. And the language used to describe these political deals is intentionally crude and over the top. When he talks about the alliance with Egypt, the Hebrew doesn't just say they were lustful. No, it literally says, "your neighbors who are large of flesh." It's a blunt, crude idiom for having huge penises. Again, the prophet is using the most graphic language he can think of to show how disgusting these political games were to God. And this might be the most twisted part of the whole metaphor. A normal prostitute gets paid, right? But Jerusalem was so depraved that she actually paid her lovers. She bribed them to come to her. And this points directly to Israel paying huge sums of tribute money to foreign empires like Assyria and Egypt to buy their protection. She was literally paying them to be her master instead of trusting her husband. So after laying out this laundry list of horrors, the prophet gets to the verdict. And under the law of the covenant she made with God, what she did, adultery and shedding innocent blood by sacrificing her children, was a capital crime. The penalty was death. And the punishment? It's laid out like a formal public execution. God says that her former lovers, the very nations she cheated with, will be the ones to carry out her sentence. They're going to strip her naked, take all her fine things, and expose her for everyone to see. Then they will stone her to death, the legal punishment for her crimes,
and then cut her body to pieces with their swords. It is a brutal, final, and honestly, a seemingly deserved end. The story seems to be over. The whore has been judged and brutally executed. And then, a single word on the page changes absolutely everything. Because after 59 verses detailing the most grotesque betrayal imaginable, the chapter hits you with one of the most shocking plot twists in the entire Bible. It's a hard turn toward an astonishing, almost unbelievable grace. God says that despite everything she's done, despite despising her vows and breaking the covenant, he says, "Yet I will remember my covenant with you." And it's not just that he'll remember the old marriage vow. He says, "I will establish for you an everlasting covenant." He's going to take her back for good.
Just think about that for a second. The chapter is 63 verses long. For nearly the entire thing, it just beats you over the head with the most vile, awful imagery of betrayal. And all of that is to set up the final message, which isn't judgment, but a grace that is so radical it's almost impossible to get your head around.
And that is the whole point. That's the rhetorical genius here. The horror of the sin has to be described in such extreme, gut-wrenching detail so that the grace that follows feels that much more profound. You have to see the absolute bottom-of-the-barrel ugliness of the betrayal to even begin to appreciate the unbelievable size of the forgiveness being offered.
And you know, this powerful metaphor doesn't just stay in the Old Testament. The book of James picks up the exact same idea and applies it to all of us. He calls his audience adulterous people and explains that friendship with the world, giving our primary love, loyalty, and trust to worldly things over God, is its own form of spiritual adultery.
And so we're left with this one final lingering question. The shocking story of Ezekiel 16, it forces us to look at our own divided loyalties, for sure. But in doing that, it also asks us to consider something far more staggering. If this is how seriously God sees our betrayal, then what in the world does that say about the impossible, incomprehensible magnitude of his grace?